So what we're going to talk with you about just for a moment is what we call the 4 pillars that keep widespread violence against women and girls in place. So what we sort of talk about is if you wanted to end all violence against women and girls, you'd have to address all 4 of these things, okay? And so what we often see in communities is that they spend time on one of these more than the other and not all 4. A big thing about the 4 pillars is we work really hard not to organize our institutions or a response this way, okay? So when we think about the 4 pillars, we want to make sure we don't replicate any of this in terms of how we organize as an institution. So one of the big things that we really want to make sure, as you know, is that those who are oppressed, their voices are included in what we do. And then we're also always thinking about creating a liberating experience and not a dominating experience with survivors or perpetrators, okay? So what that means is often for us, when we're organizing ourselves, we want to organize like a movement, like a social justice movement, and not like a service, okay? So when we do this, what we really mean by this is that we know this problem is a widespread social problem around the world, not just ones of people who are individuals who we pathologize, okay? So when I was mentioning sort of before is we don't try to address just the symptoms, we address the causes, right? So when we're looking for people to do this work, we don't do this overemphasis on their degrees that they have. We want to say what's their lived experience they have, right? And how can that contribute to the work? So we don't create standards that say you have to have a bachelor's degree or, you know, all those sorts of things. That credibility comes from experience and what your commitment is to the work. I've seen lots of people with degrees who have very little commitment to the work, okay? And that's a big, big problem. We also want to think about, and that focus is primarily to serve and partner with those who are marginalized by the violence to improve their lives, right? So we're thinking about this overall as opposed to sustaining a service. So I think perpetrator programs in the US are the worst at this, right? So, and I don't know whether this is true here, but I see a lot of perpetrator programs who just care about getting more referrals, right? They don't care about changing, you know, the social condition that brings the people to their door. They care about whether or not they have credibility to get more referrals, okay? But this is really big for us in terms of how we organize and think. So when we think about the 4 pillars, these are the 4 pillars that keep widespread violence against women in place. This notion comes from Andrea Dworkin, who was actually a sexual violence researcher. And if you want to know and understand her, she was a brilliant woman, tragic story. Andrea Dworkin, longtime activist in this work. And Andrea was actually gang raped in New York and died from an infection from the gang rape. So it's it's just a horrible story, but I always just want to give her credit because she's the one who sort of helped sort of coin this terminology of what we say are the 4 pillars that keep this work or keep this issue going. So when we think about this first one about hierarchy, it's a way in which we organize people, right? So it's the preferred way to organize. So if you take any group of people here and say we all ended up living together, would we all of a sudden say, well, who's going to lead us, right? Yeah, no, right? I would say no, right? How are we going to do this together, right? And so, but we're so used to just always organizing a group of people in a hierarchical way, it becomes like we're thinking it's natural. It's actually not natural. It's a cultural way to organize people, right? That has become so common that we sort of think about it in that sort of way. And of course, the thing that we realize about it is that a lot of people will say, well, but you can have really nice leaders. But here's the thing, okay? Yes, you can, and they still have privilege. And because of their position, they will be blind at some level to the privilege which they have. Okay? It's by the nature, when you're organized in a hierarchy, that's what will happen. Okay? So we really spent a lot of time thinking about this in terms of our work also, and have moved to more co-leadership, management team leadership in our field in order to counter this thing of having a person sort of who's in charge. But a lot of boards of directors like to have a leader, right? And we've just sort of tried to go counter against that. So the second one is submission, is that in order to have hierarchy, you have to have a group of people who also submit to the idea that this is the way it should be, okay? So you can't have hierarchy unless you have a group of people who at some level are either forced into that position or who have bought into the idea that that person should be in charge, okay? So it's a part of our work for all of us to think about what's the internal sexism that we all have, for example. What's all the internal racist biases we all have, right, about who leaders should be. So I remember one time I was getting on an airplane and I looked in the cockpit, and one of my friends who I traveled with said, "Why do you do that? Every time we travel, you're looking in the cockpit to see who's there." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I just realized I have this thinking in my head that I want it to be two men." And saying it out loud, I can't believe I think that, but I do. And I have this thing that big mechanical things are best run by men, and I feel safer getting in that plane if I do. Now that's a very right? And she's like, "Well, where'd that come from?" And I didn't know, right? I had to think about where did that come from for myself, that I believed that, right? And it was just so ingrained in me to look at. I'd never even raised my consciousness. Right now it's in my consciousness, and now I'm thinking about it. But the other thing just to remember, of course, is that when we have forced submission in relationships, the oppressed will take on the thinking of the oppressor. Any group that's oppressed takes on the thinking of the oppressor. So you often, for those of you who work with women who've been arrested or women who've had intervention orders put against them, it's a real easy group for you to hear this about, because you'll hear the thinking of their oppressor in them. Well, I'm just as violent as he is, or, he says I do this too, or he got sent to that group and he says I do that too, right? The oppressor's putting that, or that, he just says I just need, some meds. I'm bipolar. So, and I said, "Well, what do you think?" "Well, I don't know, he says this," right? And so when you live in an oppressed environment for so long, it's really natural for you to take on the thinking of the oppressor. The third one is the objectification of women. We'll never end violence against women and girls as long as women continue to be objectified, okay? And the thing about it, the internet and pornography and these OnlyFans pages and all, I just feel like, I don't know worse, but I think it's gotten worse, in some ways. I mean, I just know raising a son who's 17, he has way more access to pornography than I ever had. Like I knew my grandpa had some magazines in the basement and I shouldn't go there, right? And now my kid has a cell phone and has access to it all the time, right? But as long as women are objectified, as long as we do any sort of objectification. So we also want to be careful about this for ourselves by how we talk about perpetrators and who we are. It's also not helpful to over-objectify perpetrators, right? These horrible monsters, we don't want to do that either, right? They're more than the violence they've offended, okay? So we really want to look at objectification, but if we won't end violence against women until objectification is done. And then the last one before we do our exercise is the lack of accountability that perpetrators experience. So perpetrators have to live in a world in which they experience accountability, not just the criminal justice system. And most of us sort of follow in that blue sort of thing, right? So in a men's behavior change, hopefully they'll start to hold themselves accountable. Most of us work in the blue, but lots of men live in a world in which they don't experience any accountability. And they don't hear any messages about accountability, right? So that's why I'm saying we here in Australia, what I see is there's way too much focus on the men's behavior change, right? Not enough on the rest of the blue circle, and very little focus on the outer ring, right, in terms of change. So that shift really needs to happen in order for perpetrators. So just to give a quick example of that, my cousin Heather, and I'm not telling you anything, she's talked about this publicly, but Heather's husband, or not, her ex-husband beat her up really bad. And when he came to pick up the kids one holiday at our house, everybody knew that he had beat up Heather and Heather had left him. And not one person or family ever said anything to him about it, right? Now, I'm not saying we should have pinned him up the wall and used him for darts. That's not what I'm saying, okay? But what I am saying is our silence was also a message to him that you get to just still come into our house, pick up your kids, and nobody's going to say anything to you. And that's also not okay. So we want to figure out ways to give messages that are respectful and also challenging, right, to perpetrators when they do something. Because our silence about it isn't helpful. They feel it the same as support, okay? So think about even in your own lives, all the people you know who've committed and perpetrated domestic violence, and have you ever said anything? Why or why not, and what did you say? So we're just saying that perpetrators have to live in this sort of world of this. So what we want to do now is before lunch, we're going to do an exercise. We'll probably get through most of it before lunch, and then we'll do some of the reflective questions after we go to the next pillar part in our agenda. But what we're going to do is we're going to divide you up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take, let's see, just trying to think about the tables here. Okay, so we're going to take that back table back there. You're going to be group 1, okay? These tables right here, you're going to be group 2. And then these tables here, you're going to be group 3, okay? 1, 2, and then everybody else is group 3, okay? Now, you don't all have to sit together. You can stay at your tables, except for group 2, I would like you to merge, okay, because it's not that many. You all are going to stay right there, okay? So, yeah, so you're all going to, the rest of you are group 3, but you can stay at your table. So what we're going to look at is the hierarchy of Queensland. So we're looking at beyond just families. We're thinking about all people in Queensland, okay? So this table back here, you are the most powerful people in Queensland, okay? Yes, she's like, yes, great, I've always wanted to be, right? You are the second most powerful people in Queensland. The rest of you are the least powerful people in Queensland, okay? So what you all have to do is you all have to answer these questions, okay? So you're all each going to answer this. The first thing you're going to start with is, who are you, right? Now here's the thing about this exercise is, I don't want you talking about your group in the third person. You are this group, okay? So don't be like, well, you know, those most powerful people. Like, no, we are them, right? You're taking on the thinking and the identity of the group you've been randomly assigned.